Assalamualaikum, Dr. Muhammad. I hope you are in a good health today. Today, me and my group members will presenting on the factors that affecting gross domestic product in Malaysia. But first, let me introduce the group members from Group 4. The first presenter is me, Nur Shamimi. The second is Rabiatul Adawiyah. Third presenter, Nurul Amrina. Fourth presenter is Muhammad Amin. And last but not least, Aiman Amar. Without further ado, I'll be presenting on the first chapter, which is the introduction. For background of the study, gross domestic product measures a country's economic performance. In this study, 4 variables are utilized to determine the link between export, government expenditure, foreign direct investment, and also the female labor force participation. A good nation is one with high economic growth or income. A country's GDP is important as it will also represent the nation's development, indicating its future, and it is important for a country to maintain stable economic circumstances. Then for the problem statement, Malaysia's central bank lowered its 2022 growth prediction to 5.3% to 6.3%. Economists studied GDP growth for decades. People profit when GDP grows. GDP influences the country's economic distribution, cost of living, and environmental impact. This research investigates the influence of macroeconomic factors on developing countries' economic development. It will compare GDP to export, government expenditure, foreign direct investment, and also the female labor force participation. The GDP growth rate is rising based on user 2022. It may be difficult to identify particular elements that influence the GDP growth. This may be due to the different country historical eras or other factors. In general, the research objective of conducted are to know the factors that influence the gross domestic product. First, to examine the relationship between government expenditure and the gross domestic product in Malaysia. Secondly, to examine the relationship between the exports and the gross domestic product in Malaysia. Thirdly, is to examine the relationship between the foreign direct investment and gross domestic product in Malaysia. Last but not least, is to examine the relationship between the female labor forces and the gross domestic product in Malaysia. The following are the research question, which is the first one: is there any relationship between the government expenditure and the gross domestic product in Malaysia? The second one is there any relationship between the export and the gross domestic product in Malaysia? The third one is there any relationship between the foreign direct investment and also the gross domestic product in Malaysia? Lastly, is there any relationship between the female labor force and the gross domestic product in Malaysia? Then for the hypothesis. Hypothesis is the study of many variables. A hypothesis may assist a lead to a solution by describing the possible conclusion. This occurs through learning about many possibilities in study, and more investigation helps to solve and identify the answer. The two theories will be investigated for relevance to the issue. To meet the goal of the study on the export, government expenditure, foreign direct investment, and also the female labor force participation must influence the gross domestic product. Firstly, whether the export, government expenditure, foreign direct investment, and also the female labor force have no relationship with the gross domestic product in Malaysia, or there is for the export, government expenditure, foreign direct investment, and female labor forces have a relationship with the gross domestic product in Malaysia. That's all from me. I shall pass to the next presenter, Rabiatul Adawiyah, to explain on literature review.
Thank you, Shamimi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Rabiatul Adawiyah binti Muhammad Noor, and I will present the second chapter, which is the literature review. The dependent variable is one that is influenced by other variables that are independent of it, since it is reliant on those other factors. Okay, we choose gross domestic product (GDP) as the dependent variable for our research proposal. GDP refers to conventional measurement of the total value of the final products and services produced by a nation over a certain time. It is also defined as quantity that may be used to accurately measure economic development, and an upward moving trend in GDP is typically understood to represent expansion in the economy. A great amount of research has been carried out according to Malaysia's GDP to explore the factors that have an effect on a GDP of a country. Moving on to the independent variables for our paper, it can be defined as variable that can stand alone, which greatly influence the dependent variable. The first independent variable is export, where others believe that a rise in economic activity will lead to rise in export, which benefit from higher growth rate because they enhance productivity. In October 2021, gross export of Malaysia exceed expectation by 22.5%. This was beneficial to enhance shipment of almost all major items, including refined petroleum, producer of metal, palm oil, and associated commodities. The next variable is government expenditure, which are the funds set aside by government in order to carry out various government initiatives in order to stimulate economic growth in country. According to Abdullah in 2010, the amount of money spent by government has a major effect on the rate at which the Malaysian economy expands. The government spending is an essential factor that contributes to the success of nations in the economy, particularly that Malaysia, as there have been growth in economy. The third independent variable is the foreign direct investment, also known as FDI. From the article of Suzik 2017 mentioned that FDI is a form of international capital mobility that derives the fastest way to enter the global market in order to improve the social living of society. It is essential for the organization that intends to widen their scope of framework into the global scale to gather profit in ways which have high risk but with higher return as exchange. The last independent variable that we choose for our research proposal is the participation of female labour force. Today's economists believe that factors relating to women have a substantial bearing on the rate of economic expansion. According to newly published theoretical and empirical research, the presence of women in the labour force unquestionably contribute to economic expansion. Referring to the article written by M. Hamdan 2019, participants in the labour force by women is contingent on a number of factors, including whether or not there is a need for job, whether the jobs are available or not, and others. I think that's all from me. Next, I will pass to Nurul Amrina to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Rabiatul Adawiyah, for the explanation regarding the second chapter, which is literature review. Now, I shall continue this presentation by explaining about the third chapter, which is research methodology. Now, what is research methodology basically is? Research methodology is to discuss the methodological issues used to achieve the objectives set by this research. In Chapter 3, there is a subtopic which is research framework. A research framework assists readers in gaining a deeper understanding and has a specific focus on what the researchers would like to accomplish with their results. This framework investigated the relationships between the study's independent and dependent variables. As we can see, our research consists of 4 independent variables, which are export, government expenditure, foreign direct investment, and also female labor forces, whereas our dependent variable is the gross domestic product. From these 4 independent variables, it will affect the dependent variable either in positive or negative relationship. Moving on to the next slide, which is data collection method. As for the data collection method, the data that we use is the secondary sources. Secondary sources is the records of studies that were conducted utilizing the primary data. The information was collected via yearly reports, databases, other journals, and articles amongst other types of secondary sources. As for our analysis, most of the data were collected through the World Bank of Data's website. The next slide is about the data analysis method. The data that we use in this research is the quantitative data, which it is a method of statistical data analysis involving the collection and transformation of raw data into numerical data. So, since our research will include 30 sets of yearly reports of data from Malaysia, starting from January 1980 until December 2020, so time series analysis is the more appropriate method to use as it will give better understanding for the data set. And the tests that we used are descriptive analysis, correlation analysis, normality test, regression test, and also heteroscedasticity test. So that is all from me, and I shall pass this presentation to the next presenter, Muhammad Amin Othman, who will be explaining on Chapter 4, which is Research Analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrina. My name is Muhammad Amin. Okay, so the first analysis is descriptive analysis. to explain and summarize the data. The data is collected yearly from January 1980 till December 2020. Total number of observation is 31 data, referring to the analysis. The highest value for the mean and median from the research goes to exports with 90.25 and 89.15. For the minimum value, it goes to female labor force with the mean value 3.98 and 3.5 for median. For standard deviation, the highest value is export with 18.42 and the lowest is government expenditure with 1.06. The highest skewness is female labor force with 0.93 and the lowest skewness is government expenditure with negative 0.53. Finally is the courtesies value. The highest value is foreign direct investment, which is 3.54, and the lowest is export with a value of 1.69. Next is correlation, to identify the relationship between two variables. Referring to the analysis, FDI towards GDP show a moderate uphill relationship at 0.678, whereas GDP with GE shows a very weak uphill linear relationship at 0.153. On the other hand, the exports and the female labor force show a negative relationship towards the GDP at negative 0.031 and negative 0.198 respectively. Both variables show a very weak downhill linear relationship. There's a significant relationship between FDI and GDP at probability value at 0. The rest. Next is normality test to discover the error in term distribution. Referring to the test, data are not regularly distributed since Jarque-Bera is 33.649 and the probability is 0. Skewness of negative 1.719 indicates that the probability distribution is negative and forecasts a larger left tail of the probability distribution, and the courtesies result of 6.77 is less than 7, indicating that the distribution is less than normal. In conclusion, the data in this study are normally distributed since they have a negative probability and their distribution channel displays unnaturally high peaks. Next is heteroscedasticity test to see the variation in the residual variance of observation. Firstly, in the Bruce-Pagan test, obtain the residual equation, then to square the residual, and after that use it as a dependent variable in the auxiliary regression. After evaluating the auxiliary equation, test the overall significance with the chi-square test. The test will conclude with 6.481449. Since the chi-square value is higher than 0.05, there is no existent heteroscedasticity test problem, so it accepts the hypothesis. Last is on regression analysis to determine whether to accept a hypothesis. Based on the equation, this model explains that with an increase of 1 unit of export, there will be an increase of 0.037 towards the GDP. If there is an increase of 1 unit of GE, there will be 0.75 increase in the GDP. An increase in 1 unit of FDI will increase the GDP for 1.45 units, and GDP will increase by 0.11 if the LFF increase by 1 unit. All the IVs showed a positive correlation with asset returns. Only the FDI can be determined as significant because it is lower than the alpha at 0.0002. Research conducted by Sha'ari 2012 also indicates that FDI does not have a positive influence on the expansion of the Malaysian economy. Exports, FDI, and female labor force have positive yet insignificant relationship with the GDP. Zainuddin 2022 said that Malaysia's export dropped 23.8% in April 2020, the worst result since the global financial crisis in 2009. Yet the economy is still standing. Research on 2021 by Maulid also got the same result, that economic growth and level of variable capital expenditure is strongly negative. Lastly, female labor force participation is linked to economic development in a U-shape, which hypothesis of beneficial effects was not verified, said Lechman and Kaur 2020. We can say that economic growth is very complex process that evolved in many decades and centuries. That's all from me. Thank you. I'll pass to the next presenter.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. My name is Aiman Amar, and now I would like to continue the presentation for the chapter 5. Now, let me share the finding on the major discussions. For the research objective 1, there is a insignificant relationship between export and gross domestic product as the probability value is more than 5%. According to the Zainuddin, Malaysia's export dropped 23.8% year over year in April 2020, the worst result since the global financial crisis in 2009. For the research objective 2, there is insignificant relationship between government expenditure and gross domestic product, as the probability value is more than 5%. According to the Maulid, the link between economic growth and the level of variable capital expenditure is strongly negative. Next, for the research objective 3, there is significant relationship between the foreign direct investment and gross domestic product, as the probability value is less than 5%. According to the Sha'ari, indication the FDI does in fact have a positive influence on the expansion of the Malaysia economy. For the last research objective, there is insignificant relationship between female labour force and gross domestic product, as the probability value is more than 5%. According to the Lackman, female labour force participation is linked to economic development in a U-shape which hypothesis of beneficial effect was not verified. Next, move to the conclusion. In conclusion, there are lots of options that the government should consider before making a decision. The government is able to lessen the impact of trade restrictions and boost international commerce by simplifying and lowering the number of rules and processes. As a result, the government has the ability to invest finance and resources in the expansion of the country's export sector. Next, this study could be used to encourage further improvement by future researchers by adding other related variables that could enhance the growth in Malaysia, such as school enrollment, house consumption, gross fixed capital and others, in order to determine if the relationship is positively significant to economic growth that can raise the gross domestic product at a better rate. Next, this study could encourage more improvement by adding other related variables that could enhance growth in Malaysia. The outcome of the research are considered by regulators and researchers as providing useful input to the government of Malaysia, which will allow them to formulate more specific plans toward the aim Malaysia being a high income and sustainable nation by the year 2030. Thank you. Next, for the recommendation, the study results enable for the establishment of the following policy ideas for Malaysia's economic growth planning and GDP contribution. This does not imply that the results can be replicated to other economies that are still in the process of evolving. Even if export have no correlation with GDP in Malaysia, for instance, efforts to massively reduce export might actually have a negative impact on the country's economy. Next, the study result raised a lot of problems and concerns, including the fact that Malaysia's women don't contribute much to country's GDP. It is commonly known that the key activities that contribute to GDP are those that are a result of direct investment from other countries. The explanation for this may be found in the study that was done, as it was determined by that foreign direct investment made the highest contribution to the economic growth measured by the GDP in Malaysia. Lastly, this has made a substantial contribution to the performance of Malaysia's gross domestic product over the past decade. Malaysia has become an attractive investment destination for global and regional business expansion as a total. The finding also imply that the contribution of government expenditure to the GDP of Malaysia is not all that significant. Thank you. That's all from our group. Thank you.